August 15, 1945. The air inside the underground bunker in Tokyo hung thick with sweat and disbelief. Dust trembled on the rafters as the faint crackle of a radio filled the silence. A soft, unfamiliar voice, one no Japanese subject had ever heard before. It was the Emperor himself. For centuries he had been a divine figure, unseen, untouchable. Now his voice trembled through static. We have resolved to endure the unendurable. Outside, the once mighty imperial capital was a field of ashes, the scent of burned paper and oil still clinging to the ruins. The empire that had stretched across the Pacific had fallen, not with the bang of artillery but with the quiet surrender of a god made mortal. Across Japan, generals stood in disbelief, hands still stained with the maps of battles long lost. Some wept, others raged. A few placed their service pistols on the floor and bowed to no one, choosing death over dishonor. But many, especially those already captured or isolated, sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel shame or relief. For them, surrender was worse than defeat. It was the unraveling of their very identity. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had once conquered Singapore in 70 days. Now in a Philippine prison cell, he stared at the floorboards waiting for what he was certain would come. Execution without trial. Japan's surrender was not a single moment. It was a slow exhale that carried through a nation broken by fire. Over 3 million Japanese civilians and soldiers lay dead. 2 atomic clouds, Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th, had silenced even the most fanatical voices. In Tokyo, soldiers were ordered to stack their rifles in neat pyramids. The once proud imperial banners were lowered into the dust. Yet among the surviving officers, a darker anticipation grew. They had seen what their own army had done to Allied prisoners. Men starved, beaten, worked to death in the jungles of Burma and the Philippines. If vengeance was the way of the world, then the Americans had every right to annihilate them in turn. Rumors traveled fast through the surrender camps. The Americans will make us crawl, one officer whispered. They will parade us through their cities. Others nodded, remembering the Bataan Death March, the burning of Manila, the execution of American nurses and civilians. Justice, they assumed, would arrive as humiliation. When word came that they would be transported to American-controlled camps in Guam, and later to the mainland, few spoke. They lined up in silence, hands bound, eyes downcast, their pride now a relic of a vanished world. On the transport ship bound for Guam, the sea was calm, but the men were not. The officers sat in the hold, backs against cold steel, the air reeking of salt and diesel. A U.S. Marine corporal, barely 20, paced the deck above them. Some of the prisoners still bore the polished boots of generals. Others had traded theirs for sandals made from rope. They ate in silence, refusing to meet each other's eyes. When one whispered a prayer to the emperor, another told him to stop. It was over. For the first time in their lives, they were no longer warriors. They were captives, waiting to discover how civilization measured mercy. When the ship finally docked in Guam, the sun was blinding. The prisoners were led out in small groups, blinking against the light. And there, to their astonishment, American soldiers stood waiting, not with whips or jeers, but with order and restraint. The guards wore pressed khaki uniforms, rifles slung casually, faces expressionless. No one spat. No one shouted. An American sergeant even saluted the senior Japanese officer as he stepped off the gangplank. The general froze, uncertain whether to return the gesture. He did. It was the first salute he had given since the emperor's voice had fallen silent. The prisoners were taken to a camp surrounded by palm trees and wire fences. Inside were wooden barracks, clean bedding, latrines, even a makeshift chapel. Each man was registered, assigned a bunk, and handed a cup of water. There were rules, yes, but also structure, respect. One of the generals, gaunt and hollow-eyed, asked the interpreter where the punishment yard was. The interpreter frowned. "There is none," he replied. "You are prisoners of war, not slaves." That night, under the glow of oil lamps, some of the Japanese officers lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Others prayed silently, not for victory, but for understanding. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, American occupation forces were landing on the blackened airstrips of Atsugi and Yokohama. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in immaculate dress uniform, his sunglasses glinting in the late summer sun. Japanese civilians watched from the ruins as he strode down the runway, a conqueror who looked more like a schoolteacher than a tyrant. He issued his orders calmly. No acts of revenge. No humiliation of prisoners. Japan will be rebuilt, not destroyed. Those words traveled like shockwaves through both sides of the occupation line. For the Japanese, it was incomprehensible. For many Americans, it was an act of astonishing restraint. In the weeks that followed, groups of captured officers were flown to various detention centers, some to Manila for war crime trials, others to Guam, and finally to the United States. Fort Meade, Maryland became one such destination. Snow fell on the barbed wire fences that winter. Inside, Japanese generals were issued wool coats, cigarettes, and even notebooks to record their thoughts. Many could not bring themselves to write. One officer later recalled, "I was ready for chains. They handed me a blanket instead." Another described how a U.S. guard offered him coffee before interrogation. "We had starved American prisoners," he said quietly. "And they gave us coffee." The transformation was not immediate. Suspicion lingered. Each small kindness, food, a bed, a translator, felt like a trick. Yet days turned to weeks, and the cruelty they had prepared for never came. They watched their captors eat alongside them, laugh, even played baseball on Sundays. Some of the guards were veterans of Iwo Jima or Saipan, men who had seen friends die at the hands of Japanese troops, and yet here they were, treating their prisoners as soldiers, not monsters. For the first time, the Japanese generals began to question what honor truly meant. Their empire had glorified conquest and obedience, but now, in the hands of their enemy, they witnessed a strange kind of strength. Discipline without hatred, power without cruelty. It unsettled them more than defeat itself. As winter faded into spring, the camp at Guam grew quiet. The prisoners, once stiff and proud, began tending the gardens, writing letters home, and even attempting halting conversations in English. They were still captives, but something within them had shifted. Respect, they realized, could wound deeper than punishment. And as they stared beyond the wire fences toward the rising sun, they began to wonder whether the true humiliation was not defeat at the hands of the Americans, but discovering that their conquerors had shown them the humanity they had long forgotten to give. The heat on Guam was merciless that September, the kind that blurred the horizon and made even palm trees look tired. Beyond the white sand beaches, rows of canvas tents shimmered in the light. American military order imposed on tropical chaos. Inside the perimeter, a strange quiet ruled. Japanese generals, once gods of their own armies, now lined up for roll call under the gaze of U.S. guards who neither jeered nor bowed. To men raised on the conviction that defeat erased all humanity, this silence was unbearable. They had braced for vengeance. What they found instead was order, cold, methodical, and disarmingly polite. Each morning began the same way. The Americans stood at attention, crisp and expressionless, rifles gleaming. The Japanese officers, stripped of insignia, answered to numbers now, not names. And yet, when the senior guard saluted, the gesture was exact, measured not in mockery, but in protocol. General Hama Masaharu, who had once commanded 80,000 men in the Philippines, could barely meet the young sergeant's eyes. The Americans acted not as victors indulging in triumph, but as men performing a duty. That difference gnawed at the prisoners. It stripped them of the familiar narrative of cruelty they had built to make defeat bearable. The camp commandant, Colonel Robert Hall, embodied that contradiction. A career officer from Nebraska, he had fought in New Guinea and lost friends to Japanese bullets. Yet his instructions to his men were simple. They are soldiers, not animals. Treat them as you would expect to be treated. Beneath his tense canvas walls, he insisted on clean water, fair rations, and translators for every interrogation. Some thought him naive. Others suspected strategy, mercy as a weapon sharper than fear. But Hall believed discipline was its own victory. "If we act like them," he once told a lieutenant, "then we didn't win anything at all." The prisoners could not comprehend such logic. For them, compassion was weakness, mercy an insult to honor. When a guard offered a cigarette, most refused. When coffee was served, they drank in silence, hands trembling slightly. One interpreter later recalled they expected fists. They received courtesy. It frightened them more. Still, small gestures began to chip away at the barrier between conqueror and conquered. A U.S. corporal named James Foster, barely 22, noticed that one of the generals, an older man with trembling hands, had trouble holding his spoon. The next morning, Foster quietly set down a fork. The man stared at it for a long time before nodding once deeply. Outside the wire, life continued at an almost surreal normalcy. American soldiers played baseball near the beach. Laughter echoed against the jungle. The sound carried across the camp, mixing with the call of seabirds. To the prisoners, that laughter was alien. How could men who had lost so much still find joy? They had been taught that the Americans were decadent, undisciplined, ruled by emotion. Yet here were men who could smile without mockery, who saluted the same men they had fought just months earlier. The contradiction was unbearable. News trickled in from home through carefully censored letters. Tokyo was occupied, the emperor untouched. MacArthur's headquarters issued orders forbidding humiliation of Japanese prisoners. It was an unprecedented command in the history of warfare. Instead of parading their enemies, the Americans rebuilt their barracks and returned their swords for ceremonial display. Some Allied officers questioned the wisdom of such restraint. But the decision was deliberate. an assertion that civilization meant more than victory. The United States had chosen to demonstrate that strength could coexist with dignity. There were moments of awkward humor, too. One afternoon, a Japanese general attempted to bow to a sergeant delivering lunch. Unsure what to do, the young American instinctively bowed back, nearly spilling the tray. The prisoners stared confused as the guard stammered, "No offense, sir." Later, when word of the exchange spread through the camp, both sides laughed for the first time. Even in the shadow of war, absurdity found its way in. Yet beneath the civility, tension simmered. Interrogations were frequent but calm, conducted with precision rather than rage. The generals, accustomed to shouting and intimidation, were disarmed by the quiet tone of their questioners. American intelligence officers sought not vengeance but understanding. The structure of command, supply lines, the psychology that fueled Japan's suicidal devotion. "We wanted to know how a nation convinces millions to die smiling," one officer later said. The Japanese, in turn, were stunned that their captors asked why, not just how. The Americans' respect was not universal. Some guards despised their orders, remembering friends lost at Iwo Jima or Okinawa. They followed protocol but avoided eye contact. Others, unexpectedly, began to feel empathy. Many of the Japanese prisoners were older, frail, haunted by exhaustion more than guilt. They were no longer the monsters propaganda had painted. They were men hollowed out by belief. Late at night, guards overheard murmured conversations in Japanese, discussions about the emperor, shame, and the meaning of survival. For the first time, they heard generals doubt the creed that had defined their lives. By November, a quiet rhythm had settled over the camp. Prisoners helped maintain the grounds, swept the paths, even repaired damaged huts. They did it not out of obedience, but because they were treated like men, expected to behave honorably. The Americans observed with curiosity, discipline born of respect, not fear. It was a lesson that would echo in both nations for decades, and yet mercy came with its own cost. Outside the wire, hundreds of thousands of Allied POWs still carried scars from Japanese camps. Malnutrition, beatings, unspeakable cruelty. When news of American leniency spread, some veterans were furious. "You're feeding the devils who starved us," one survivor wrote to Washington. The debate reached newspapers back home. Should war criminals be shown humanity? Or was compassion part of the victory itself? The government stood firm. To rebuild peace, it declared, one must first prove that decency survives even war. In the camp, the paradox deepened. The Japanese officers could not reconcile the Americans' composure with the destruction their bombs had caused. How could men who had vaporized entire cities still treat prisoners gently? The contradiction gnawed at them like hunger. One general confided to his diary, "We believed they had no soul. But I see now they possess one stronger than ours." Those pages, recovered years later, became quiet evidence that the human heart can be conquered without a shot fired. By winter, the tropical air turned cool. Christmas arrived, and the Americans, half out of routine, half curiosity, set up a small tree near the mess hall. To everyone's surprise, the Japanese prisoners asked permission to hang paper cranes upon it. When the night came, candles flickered in the wind, and the two sides stood together in uneasy silence. No speeches, no toasts. Just the faint smell of pine and kerosene mingling under foreign stars. When the lights went out that night, one of the guards wrote in his journal, "They expected cruelty. We gave them order. They expected hatred. We gave them coffee, and now, they're not sure what to believe." Beyond the barbed wire, the ocean shimmered in the moonlight, indifferent and endless. The war was over, but the reckoning was not. Soon ships would arrive again, this time not to deliver mercy, but justice. For men like Yamashita and Hama, respect had not saved them. It had merely made the waiting harder, the judgment heavier, the meaning of honor more uncertain than ever before. The courtroom in Manila smelled of humidity and iron, a place where justice and memory collided under the weight of a ruined world. Ceiling fans turned lazily, doing little to cut through the thick air. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of soldiers, reporters, and translators. On the raised platform at the front sat General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, his back straight, his uniform faded to the color of dust. He did not look like the conqueror who had once taken Singapore with cunning speed. He looked like a man stripped bare of myth, a relic of a vanished empire now awaiting judgment from his enemies. Across the room, American officers shuffled papers, their posture crisp, their expressions disciplined but wary. They had not forgotten Bataan or the massacres of Manila. Yet the trial was not revenge. It was procedure. Every word, every gesture was meant to show the world that justice, not fury, guided the victors. The defense table held a small irony. Yamashita's own lawyer was an American, Colonel Harry Clark, who had once served under MacArthur. It was Clark's duty to defend the man his comrades despised. "Even the guilty," he had said quietly, "deserve the law." Outside, Manila was still a city of ghosts. Burned-out tanks rusted beside the courthouse. Civilians passed by the gates carrying baskets of rice, their eyes averted. They knew what had happened here in February, when retreating Japanese soldiers without order or mercy slaughtered more than 100,000 civilians. The blood had seeped into the cobblestones, yet inside the court there was no shouting, no violence, only the solemn rhythm of testimony and translation, the uneasy meeting of law and war. The prosecution presented photographs, piles of bodies, shattered churches, mothers clinging to lifeless children. They called witnesses who spoke in trembling voices, describing executions and fires. Yamashita listened without visible emotion. When asked if he had ordered these atrocities, he replied through his interpreter, "I did not. I could not control every man in the field." His words were calm, almost sorrowful. To the Americans, they sounded like evasion. To the Japanese observers, they were confession through restraint. In their culture, responsibility flowed upward. To lead was to bear the weight of all below. The Americans introduced a new concept, command responsibility. It declared that a general was accountable for crimes committed by his subordinates, even without his direct order. It was a principle forged in the ashes of war, designed to ensure that power could no longer hide behind distance. Yamashita's trial became the test case, the moral experiment of a new world order. Yet as the arguments unfolded, the paradox deepened. The Americans who had bombed cities into dust were now lecturing on restraint. The Japanese officers who had glorified obedience now argued for individual conscience. Each side mirrored the other in unsettling ways. During recess, guards escorted Yamashita to a small cell adjoining the courtroom. There, away from the crowd, his stoicism sometimes cracked. One interpreter recalled him staring at his hands and murmuring, "A general is born to die with his men, but my men are dead and I am still breathing." He neither begged nor protested. His silence carried the weight of generations raised on the Bushido code, the belief that honor meant accepting fate, even when unjust. Colonel Clark, exhausted by weeks of testimony, once asked him if he wanted to make a final appeal. Yamashita shook his head. "The law is yours," he said quietly. "The shame is mine." Clark later wrote that defending him felt like standing between history and conscience. In the evenings, the two men sat in silence. Clark smoked. Yamashita folded origami from scrap paper. It was the only time the general's hand seemed steady. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed. The lead judge read slowly, his voice echoing off the cracked plaster walls. The defendant, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, is found guilty of failing to control his troops, and is hereby sentenced to death by hanging. No cheers, no applause, only a stillness so deep it felt sacred. Yamashita bowed once, then whispered, "I have done my duty. May God have mercy." It was both prayer and farewell. Outside, reporters rushed to file their stories. Some hailed the decision as justice for the atrocities in the Philippines. Others questioned its fairness. Even a few American jurists later called it legally shaky but morally inevitable. Yet within Japan, the reaction was one of stunned silence. Many could not believe their heroes were being tried at all, let alone by foreigners who had leveled Tokyo and Nagasaki. The trials became a mirror in which the empire was forced to confront itself. At Guam, similar proceedings unfolded for lesser officers. The Americans conducted each trial with meticulous formality. Translators, witnesses, evidence displayed on chalkboards. They served rice and tea to the defendants. The guards saluted them as they were led in. The paradox persisted. Men who had violated every rule of war were judged with almost ceremonial respect. To the Japanese, that dignity was both incomprehensible and devastating. It revealed a strength that did not come from swords or slogans but from control. The moral discipline of a victor who refused to gloat. On the night before his execution, Yamashita wrote a letter to his wife. "I have lived as a soldier," he wrote in neat, deliberate strokes. "I will die as one. Do not grieve. Teach our children that the emperor's path must now be peace." When the guards entered his cell at dawn, he stood tall, his uniform pressed, his eyes calm. As they led him to the gallows, one of the American officers instinctively saluted. To everyone's surprise, Yamashita returned it with precision. The rope was placed around his neck. The general's final words were whispered through the interpreter. "I believe I have done my duty to my country." The lever dropped. Silence followed. Back in the camp at Guam, the news spread quickly. Some prisoners wept. Others stared at the floor, unable to speak. General Hama, awaiting his own trial, spent that night writing. "The Americans are strange," he noted. "They kill us with courtesy. They destroy our bodies but save our dignity. Perhaps this is their victory." When his time came, he too would bow before his captors, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of something he could not name. The trials continued for months, dozens of officers, thousands of testimonies. Each verdict carved another scar across the conscience of Japan. Yet through it all, the Americans maintained their discipline. No cruelty, no spectacle, only the relentless machinery of law. By the time the last gavel fell, the meaning of honor itself had changed. No longer was it measured by how one died, but by how one accepted judgment. When the final sentence was carried out, a pale dawn rose over Manila. The guards folded the flags, the witnesses signed their reports, and the world moved on. But among those who lived through it, the paradox remained. How the conquerors had shown mercy without weakness, and how the defeated had found dignity through punishment. Far away in the snow-covered barracks of Fort Meade, another group of Japanese officers read the reports in stunned silence. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they saw a kind of justice they had never imagined. And as they sat beneath the humming lights, one of them whispered, "If respect can survive war, then perhaps we have not lost everything." Yet none of them knew that the next chapter would reveal something even stranger, that mercy itself could become the seed of transformation. Snow fell softly over Fort Meade that winter, wrapping the Maryland countryside in a quiet that felt almost sacred. Inside the barbed wire perimeter, Japanese officers shuffled between barracks, their heavy coats buttoned to the throat. The war was over, the trials concluded, yet a strange tension still lingered. A silence not of fear, but of reflection. These men had come prepared to die in shame. Instead, they had been given blankets, books, and time to think. It was mercy that struck the hardest blow. Mercy, they realized, could not be resisted. Each morning began with the same ritual. The bugle sounded at dawn, echoing faintly across the frost. The prisoners stood in lines as American guards performed roll call, voices clipped but never cruel. There were no beatings, no shouted orders. When one officer slipped on the icy path, a young American soldier, barely old enough to shave, helped him up, dusting snow from his shoulder. The gesture was small, almost forgettable, but it left a wound deeper than any sword. The general bowed in silence, ashamed by the kindness. He had seen what his own army had done to captives, starving, striking, reducing them to animals. Now his enemy treated him as a man. The camp library became an unlikely sanctuary. There, among the smell of paper and coal smoke, Japanese officers spent long hours reading English books, Lincoln speeches, the Bible, even American novels about home and honor. Translators moved from table to table, explaining phrases that carried meanings foreign to the Japanese tongue. Liberty, dignity, due process. At first they studied out of curiosity. Later they read because something within them demanded understanding. One officer wrote in his diary, "They beat us with words we cannot yet translate." Meals were simple, bread, coffee, stew, but served with a consistency that unnerved the prisoners. There was no hierarchy in the mess hall. Captains and privates stood in the same line, receiving the same ladle of food. It offended their sense of rank, but also stirred something unfamiliar: equality. The Americans laughed freely, sometimes offering extra bread or cigarettes. To men who had lived in rigid obedience all their lives, such casual humanity felt almost blasphemous. Colonel Robert Hall, the camp commandant, often walked among. The Americans trusted the prisoners enough to allow work details beyond the wire: chopping wood, repairing fences, clearing snow. One afternoon, a blizzard struck without warning. The guards and prisoners worked side by side to reinforce the tents. When it was over, both groups huddled near the same fire. A guard passed around a thermos of coffee. A Japanese major lifted it carefully, took a sip, and whispered, "This is the taste of strange victory." At night, the barracks glowed dimly with oil lamps. The men spoke in low voices, reflecting on the meaning of defeat. "We thought strength came from obedience," one said, "but they have conquered us with discipline of the heart." Another replied, "Maybe mercy is their bushido." The words lingered in the cold air like smoke, fragile but enduring. When spring finally came, the first green shoots appeared in the camp garden. The men watched them grow with reverence. They began writing essays in English about what they had learned, short reflections filled with humility and confusion. One of them wrote, "America's greatest weapon was not the bomb. It was restraint." Another, older and closer to death, wrote, "They destroyed our empire, but they saved our souls." Colonel Hall received these writings quietly, keeping them in a small box in his office. He understood their significance even if the world outside did not. To him, the war's end was not measured in surrendered documents or executions, but in the faint, unspoken shift that occurred when hatred gave way to comprehension. By late 1946, orders came for the prisoners' repatriation. The announcement was met not with relief but with unease. They had expected to leave in chains, yet were told they would return as free men. On departure day, snow flurried again, soft, almost merciful. the American them without guards. His boots crunched softly on the snow, his voice calm and measured. He greeted the prisoners in broken Japanese, asking about their health, their families, their thoughts. They could not understand why a victor would bother. One day he stopped by a general kneeling in the garden, his hands deep in the frozen earth. "Spring will come," Hall said. The general looked up, confused. "In my country," he replied, "spring is for the living." Hall smiled faintly. "Then live," he said, and walked on. Over the weeks, something shifted. The Japanese began tending the garden with care, trimming the hedges, shaping small stones into paths. They built a tiny torii gate near the edge of the barracks, painting it red with leftover barn paint. The Americans said nothing. Some even brought tools. The camp, once a symbol of defeat, became a place of quiet transformation. For the first time, these men felt what it meant to rebuild without conquest. There were moments of bitter irony, too. A U.S. chaplain, noticing the prisoners' discipline, invited them to attend a Sunday service. They hesitated, uncertain if it was a trap. But curiosity won. Inside the small wooden chapel, the chaplain spoke of forgiveness, not as surrender, but as freedom from hatred. His voice was gentle, his message clear. Even those who lose everything, he said, can still choose what kind of men they wish to be. Some of the Japanese bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in something close to understanding. Letters began to arrive from home. Families described cities slowly rising from rubble, factories reopening, children learning English phrases from occupation teachers. The emperor himself had renounced divinity, declaring that Japan must now walk the path of peace. For men who had once seen him as a god, the words were shocking. Yet, in the warmth of their barracks, they began to see what that meant. One general wrote, "Perhaps he was not diminished but made human like us." As months passed, respect replaced fear. Guards lined up along the path, saluting as the Japanese officers filed past. One of the generals, once too proud to meet their eyes, stopped and bowed deeply. A few guards, unsure of what to do, returned the gesture. On board the ship home, the sea was calm. The men stood on deck, staring at the receding coast of a land that had once been their prison and had somehow become their teacher. "We thought we understood honor," one murmured. "But perhaps honor is not dying for one's country. It is learning to live differently after." When they reached Japan, they stepped into a nation reborn. Children waved small American flags beside rising cranes and new buildings. The men walked through the streets quietly, not as heroes, not as traitors, but as witnesses to a strange truth: that mercy can remake what war destroys. Years later, one of those generals would write in his memoir, "We believed that power lay in fear. America showed us that true power lies in dignity. The sword cuts clean, but respect cuts deeper." That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.